Hi, I'm Martin Perlich, and I have the great honor of sitting in the apartment in New York with Elliott Carter, who needs no introduction. As you know, if you're watching this, you know who he is, the great composers of all time, certainly in America at this day. He's written a piece which Jeff Wunderschmidt and Southwest Chamber are performing, giving the American premiere, and also taking with us, because I'm going with him to Vietnam. And it's a wonderful piece, a setting of two cantos of Ezra Pound, and it's called I'm Conversing with Paradise. I thought, Mr. Carter, for one thing, it's just an absolutely beautiful selection of cantos.
Well, thank you very much.
I haven't heard the pieces yet. I know Ali Nussen gave a performance where, in England?
Yeah, it's coming out on commercial disc in another month or two.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, I've known about Ezra Pound since before I went to college, when I was in high school, because I knew a woman, Catherine Ruth Heyman, who was an expert in playing Scriabin, and she had lived with Ezra Pound before that, and in fact he wrote a poem about her called Scriptura Ignotus, but he even in the recent biography of Ezra Pound tells he wanted to help her get concert. He wanted to be a manager for her for a while. So I've heard about Ezra Pound all my life practically. I would say, 70 years or more. So that, and I've followed it. I find him sometimes obscure, but there have been poems. Before he started to write all those cantos, there were a lot of separate poems that were quite wonderful, I thought. And then the wonderful thing about Ezra Pound was that he helped all American poets of any importance and got their works published. He helped T.S. Elliott rewrite The Wasteland. He was a very, very important figure in the life of American poetry, and he wrote this gigantic series of cantos that are sometimes a little hard to read, but in any case, finally there was this extraordinary problem that came up in his life, as you probably know. And the big problem was that he was living in Rapallo in Italy, and the war started. He was very much against the war in the first place, against the Second World War. In fact, he was kind of, in some ways, a rather crazy man and very violent emotionally. He came to America before we got into the war with the intention of talking to the president about how bad it would be for us to get into the war. Obviously, it didn't work because he couldn't meet the president, but he did speak to several other people in the government. He felt that the main problem of going to war for us would be that it would be very profitable for bankers. And he always felt that bankers were very destructive in civilization in many ways. It comes out in many, many different cantos. And so he felt very strongly about that. When we did get into the war, he was given the opportunity to speak over the Italian radio in Rome in English about how we should never join the war because the bankers were making a fortune out of it. He felt very strongly about that, and as a result, he was classified as a traitor. And when the American army began to invade Italy, he was arrested and as a traitor, and he was put in a camp outside of Pisa. And it was a dreadful thing that camp. He was put in a cage outdoors for quite a while. Now that's no joke for a man who's 60 years old or so. So that he finally, the soldiers themselves felt a little sorry for him, so they gave him a little tent inside of his cage, and then later he was brought into the house. Meanwhile, he was going on writing all those cantos, and among which is the thing that I was sent. It's the 81st canto, and he was he was determined. The story went on to the fact when the war was over, he was sent back to the United States, and there was a trial because he would have been a traitor, and he knew all the time that he would be. He was considered a traitor, and he could easily be killed for it. So this is all in the background of his mind. And then, at the trial, they had the psychoanalysts and people studying him, and they decided he was crazy, a crazy man. He couldn't be tried, and they put him in an insane asylum. At the insane asylum, all the American poets went and visited him. And it's because of this, actually, that one of the poets that I knew very well, Robert Lowell, is the one that pointed out these particular verses to me in the cantos. One of the reasons that I chose those, because I said to Cal Lowell, I find Ezra Pound's cantos hard to read. He said, well, you look at that. And that's what I've said.
Well, let me direct you to those, then, because they're magnificent choices. They're great choices. It's wonderful poetry. And furthermore, the text has great meaning. For one thing, it's a great deal about music. Number 81, Canto 81 is a great deal about music. He mentions one of the great English composers, and that's William Laws.
Yes.
And also Jenkins and Dolmetsch, who was a big force in American.
Well, you see, that was what he was in London at a time when the people started to take early music seriously. Mm-hmm. Dolmetsch was one of the first people to start making and presenting Elizabethan music, particularly, to the public. And Pound was very impressed by that. Now, let me say that Pound was interested in musical art in many ways. In fact, he wrote 2 operas. He wrote an opera on the life of Francois Villon, which is he didn't really know how to compose, but he was trying to write music that sounded like the period of Francois Villon, which is kind of crazy, but it's very tiresome, but sort of odd.
Well, let me go to the text here. I mean,
and he wrote a book on George Antheil.
That I didn't know either. Antheil. What I see here is, and I've quoted them in my notes, and I love them, the 120th canto.
Well, that's
the name of your piece is On Conversing with Paradise, and Pound says, I have tried to write paradise. Do not move. Let the wind speak. That is paradise.
Well, I mean, he was a man who was so involved with the field of poetry that he felt that paradise, that to write the perfect poem was to be in paradise. And of course he never wrote the perfect poem, probably even according to himself. He tried to do it, and I mean, this is one of those things that sort of fanciful people like that have in their mind, and it's nice, but it's kind of crazy too.
He also says, pull down, this is from 81, Canto 81, pull down thy vanity. I say, pull down. But to have done instead of not doing, this is not vanity. To have gathered from the air a live tradition, or from the fine old eye the unconquered flame, this is not vanity. Here the error is all in the not done, all in the diffidence that faltered.
Yes, it's just wonderful he had this extraordinary gift of writing words that were really very impressive, even when they're kind of confused. But and what you're reading is very beautiful, I think. Now, the pull down thy vanity is people have wondered whether he was saying it to himself, whether he was saying it to the American soldiers, or who he was saying it for. But I think he was actually pulling his own vanity down in this section, because he must have realized that he shouldn't have talked over the battalion radio that way and gotten himself into trouble. And I'm sure that part of it was the fact that he was such a vain man. I used to see, after he left all this and left to be in insane asylum, he never spoke again. But when when I used to go to Venice occasionally, I used to see him walking around. He had a big heavy hat, looked like Goethe. But he was an impressive figure, even in his old age.
Not unlike yourself. I should comment that "Pull Down My Vanity" is something that's a universal
Yes, of course.
An implication of the humble, of humility, and the artist should always be humble, I think.
Oh, there's no doubt that that's what's thought. I mean, that it was certainly, he was giving sort of a sermon to how to be an artist, which I read too as that, of course.
I wanted to talk to you about your own music and about some of the synthesis. I see 4 syntheses in your music. I've read a number of your essays and lectures. I've listened to your music for a number of years. And now I've just reviewed them for the last week or so, and have had a wonderful time doing it. But these are the syntheses I see, and I'll say them, and then we'll go back and talk about them, if we may. The synthesis between American and European artistic musical concepts, ideas.
Of course, when I was in college and when I decided I wanted to be a composer, I heard Aaron Copland's music at the Boston Symphony. And I got to know Aaron very much, and at that particular time, everyone wanted, and particularly the conductor of the Boston Symphony, wanted Americans to establish an American field just the way the Russians had some time back. This was something that was very much on everybody's mind at that time. It was something that bothered me because I had become interested in being a composer when I heard what was considered very advanced music, Varese and Stravinsky and Schoenberg, which were played here in New York when I was very young, and I liked that better really than this Americanizing thing. But I got it. Well, I went and studied in Paris, and by that time the old avant-garde was beginning to seem like something old-fashioned. That if you wrote that very dissonant atonal music, it was something that's already finished. And so I began to write. I felt a little bit like that because it was, after all, it was music that nobody wanted to hear except a few people. It was elitist music. And so I felt I ought to write music that was a little bit more accessible to other people. And so I had a period when I wrote music of that type. And it was also, I had put jazz in it and all sorts of things. And then, at the end of the war, end of the Second War, I began to feel that I would like to go back to what had originally interested me, to being composer, the works of Schoenberg. And of course, at the end of the war, all the young composers went back to that too, because it was something that Hitler had forbidden. And so I was not the only one who was concerned with that. I started a little before most of them, but we found a program in which I had organized, in which a whole program of Webern's music back, God knows when. When was that, Virgil? 60s? Was it 50s, wasn't it?
It was in the 50s.
Shortly after Webern was shot.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I
Right after the war. Barely after the war.
Yes.
Well, let me then, before we go to the European side, which I know has to do with Nadia Boulanger, we'll talk about counterpoint and those things. But the American side, I know, is heavily influenced by Charles Ives as well, whom you knew.
Well, I knew Charles Ives also from the very beginning of my life,
Right.
because I had a teacher that introduced me to him when he was living down here in Gramercy Park. And he was quite a character. I remember we talked about Stravinsky, and he was very much against Stravinsky because Stravinsky repeated things too much. You shouldn't repeat. He would sit down and show how the Firebird, for instance, at the beginning repeats that phrase twice. That's wrong. So he felt very strongly about it. He was very much against it. He was the one that actually encouraged me to be a composer because I wrote crazy little pieces like that. And he was interested. He wrote Ives wrote a recommendation for me to get into Harvard University too. And Ives was somebody that he gave me all the scores that he had personally printed, so that I knew a good deal of his music very early on. I liked some of it very much, and I still like a lot of it. But
Two questions.
Very, very I've had very mixed feelings about it as I've grown older, because it's kind of crazy in some way. I feel that he didn't quite get through what he wanted to get through. He didn't have enough. I don't know what it was. I mean, he didn't have. Of course, we have the advantage of having a lot of experience with what might be called dissonant music, but he didn't. So therefore, he had a problem how to deal with all of that, which he wanted to do.
Could it also be that he was not a full-time composer, that he was an insurance agent as well? Could it be that he was an insurance agent that took a lot of his time? Would that have been something, since he wasn't a full-time composer and didn't have the time actually to push that way? Could that have been part of it?
Yeah, it's very... Yes, of course, the big problem is that he used to actually be an organist in the church around the corner here. And he lived down here. He used to live on this street when he first came out of Yale. And then he was trying to be a musician, and he finally met his future wife, whatever her name, Twitchell, who was the daughter of a minister, Harmony Twitchell, and Harmony Twitchell was a more educated and more sophisticated woman than Ives, and he felt that they ought to have a proper place to live and lead a nice, comfortable life. And as a result, he went into insurance in order to do that. And as a result, he wrote much less of his music. And then there was a very large period when he was quite ill, and I think by 1928 or so, he stopped composing altogether.
Was he at any time your family insurance man? I've heard that.
Yes, my father, I forgot what company it was. My father got it insured, but when Father I've heard that Ives was a composer, he stopped.